Albert Einstein said, "Don't think about why you question, simply don't stop questioning." Welcome to Curated Questions. I am your host, Ken Woodward. And these questions are not mathematical equations, but rather a resource to encounter personal reflection and growth. As Tupac Shakur stated, even the genius asks questions. Now, let's engage the questioning community. Greetings, Ken Woodward here. Welcome back to another episode of Curated Questions. Together, we engage inquisitive humans about how they use questions to navigate and make sense of our world. I'm a fellow traveler and pilgrim on this journey, and I'm glad you're here. Before we get started, I'm jumping in real quick to provide a trigger warning. This is a very rich and meaningful conversation, and it does include a couple brief examples of my guest's experience with the death of children. While not graphic, I do want listeners to be aware. Now, enjoy the show. Today's conversation is with Joe Primo. Joe is the CEO of Grateful Living, an organization based on the work of Brother David Steindl-Rast, a 98-year-old author, scholar, and Benedictine monk who is also known as the grandfather of gratitude. In his prior work with dying patients and grieving children, Joe encountered the deep sorrow and always available joy that permeates our search for meaning. Gratefulness for life, he believes, is foundational to discovering meaning and the only response that is big enough and appropriate for the plot twists, delights, surprises, and devastation we encounter along the way. A student of Brother David since his studies at Yale Divinity School, Joe is committed to advancing their global movement and making the transformational practice of grateful living both accessible to all and integral to communities and places of belonging. As an international speaker, author, and commentator, Joe has served on numerous boards, and he is also the author of What Do We Tell the Children? Talking to Kids About Death and Dying. He was previously the CEO of Good Grief. Joe, welcome to Curated Questions.
Hi, Ken. So good to meet you.
It's good to have you here. I love talking the kind of opposing things of good and grief and gratitude. So I think we'll be covering much ground during the conversation.
Indeed.
I often like to start with the question of, when did you first understand the power of questions?
Yeah, I think probably the best way for me to answer that question, Ken, is to right up front share how I think about questions. I think from my perspective, the goal of an excellent question is for it to be an inquiry for greater understanding, right? And so often a well-crafted question or inquiry is really, really simple, even though the inquiry may be an enormous subject matter. But I think a common predicament that we have with excellent questions is that we get in the way. And I want to tell you a story that precedes the main event. So,
Okay.
just to set up a little bit about my career, I began working at the first hospice in the US, the Connecticut Hospice. I was 22 years old. Who would put me in front of dying patients at 22 is beyond me. And I was a hospice chaplain, a role that for me had a lot of baggage. The slipper didn't fit. I really struggled to embody that role. I was self-conscious about it. I was anxious. It was a title that had a lot of baggage, and I felt the assumptions that people were making about me because I was in that role. And very early on, an octogenarian died. A guy who I didn't meet while he was dying. He arrived already in the dying process. Super large family, kids, grandkids. He dies, and I'm called in. And as the family is continuing to arrive, I just sit there feeling pretty anxious and self-conscious as we were waiting for more family members. And I just kept looking around the room, and the family was really stiff. It was a moment where a good question really could have helped, but I was anxious. I was starting to have this like little out of body experience where it was going through the motions and I just wasn't really there. What I knew about this guy is that he was Roman Catholic. So on my way up to his room, I grabbed a Catholic prayer book and I thought, well, that's going to be a good thing. That's what they want, right? I didn't ask. I assumed. And once the whole
Mm.
family arrived, I launched into this 10-minute prayer right out of the book. And I just kept going and going. I was like, well, this is normal. I'm just reading the book. I'm just doing what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah.
But because it was an out of body experience, it wasn't until I was leaving the room, I was like, wow, they were really frosty. What was that about? And then I came back into myself, Ken, and I realized that when I opened that prayer book, I went to the prayers for a dead priest. For 10 minutes, I was reading out loud to this family, to this man with all of his grandkids about this priest who served in this role as a priest. Right? I was so outside of myself. I didn't even hear the words coming out of my mouth. I'm just thinking like, these
Wow.
poor grandkids, they must have been like, what other secrets did grandpa have? Right? Like, oh my God, it's so mortifying. And what's my point in this story? I wasn't present. I didn't ask what they needed or what they wanted. I assumed. I just jumped into it. I allowed my anxiousness to distract me from the opportunity that was right in front of me. I could have asked a question that fostered connection, that really grounded people, that family in the moment. I could have said, hey, how did he enrich your life? What will you miss most about him? What about him now or in the end of his life really surprised you? What do you wish he understood about you that he didn't? Like, imagine if I
Mm.
asked any of those questions rather than reading the wrong prayer to the family for 10 minutes, right? Like, what an awkward conversation for grandma to have after. Like, hey, guys, grandpa's not a priest and I'm not a nun. That didn't happen.
Just for the record.
Just for the record. But you know, Ken, life is a wild, fabulous thing, and as awkward and terrible and as ashamed as I felt immediately after I realized what I had done, life gave me another opportunity to practice. So at this hospice was an infant, baby J, with a rare disease. The docs were doing some really tricky sorcery type of magic to keep this infant alive. And some of what they were doing, like it was going up to the edge of, hey, is this ethical anymore? And I was obviously the chaplain, but also training in medical ethics. So the doctor said, you know, this is getting muddy. Can you go in and have a conversation? And again, 22-year-old self-conscious, anxious me having to walk in and talk to these parents about, is it time to let baby J die?
Mm.
And so as I was being asked that, to go in and to provide that service, I knew in that very moment, like, hey, Joe, this is game time. You got to get grounded and you got to get out of your own way. I understood that what was needed was a gentle presence, and that my role was to understand what they were going through, that was really the only path forward. And so I thought really long and hard about, well, how do I begin this conversation? What are
Mm.
questions that I need to ask in order to achieve those goals I named earlier of understanding, a gentle inquiry so that I could learn? So I began crafting my questions, right? I wondered, like, hey, to the parents, what hopes did you have for baby J while you were pregnant? How did you imagine your life would change as parents?
Mm.
What are the best characteristics you think the other parent would have shared and given to baby J? And what type of life did you envision for him? Right? I wanted to understand their perspective and what it was that they were actually holding on to, even though they could see right before them that his little life was ending. Right? I recognized in this reflection and the power of questions, Kay, that my role wasn't to show up there and say, hey, guys, come on, like, look around you. Can you not see what everybody else is seeing here? Right? Like,
Mm.
No, that not only would
Right.
that have been bad and malpractice, but that wouldn't have helped them do the important work that they needed to do, right? It needed to be an exploratory question so that they could see for themselves that the life that they had envisioned for baby Jay was not possible, that his birth was ultimately a conclusion and not a commencement. Like that's something
Mm.
only a parent's heart can arrive at and understand, right? That you can't be told that. So my simple understanding from experience is that how you arrive to the question is as important as the question itself, right? You
That's
got to get out
beautiful.
of your own way. And that's how you're best also going to receive the answer that you're being given.
Thank you for that story. I can't, well, you've lived it. So being in the presence and trying to care for folks in those brutal circumstances. Yeah, I don't know what training a 22-year-old could go through other than the fire.
Fire.
Wow.
Indeed.
Wow. As you explained the care in which you came up with your questions and you really thought through that, I think it's beautiful. Depending on how we're using questions, where we're using questions, there's probably not a lot of thought that's put into it.
Mm.
But because you're in these kinds of circumstances, you are very intentional about it. And that is a takeaway. If we're going to be in a circumstance where we're going to be using questions, intentionally taking some time
Mm.
and really thinking about the entire environment,
Mm.
what's really needed, and then carefully crafting.
Mm.
I think that's just a beautiful example you outlined there.
Yeah. But in that careful crafting, that intentionality, we don't have to allow our fear of getting it right to prevent us from taking the risk of still asking the question. Because I think oftentimes, if we put too much pressure on ourselves to get it right, then we never speak at all. And there are
Hmm.
enormous dangers in that.
Yes, not these kind of circumstances, but certainly in other circumstances, I've found mostly in like conversations about race, where I'm like, I'm probably going to get this wrong in some capacity. And yet I need to be in on the conversation. I'm going to stumble and assume that I'm going to get some of it wrong, but let's engage and feel our way through. So to your point of be intentional, let me put in the time and still approach. And then it's an exploratory effort that we'll do to engage, to be able to care.
Yeah, there's a spiritual proverb about you don't learn how to swim by taking a book off the shelf, right? It's not like swimming for dummies. That's not how you learn. You got to jump in and you got to do. And that requires a sort of courage and experimentation and knowing that in the doing is how we learn. By calling grandpa a priest for 10 minutes is how we return to ourselves and very much feel embodied, because it is really uncomfortable to be embodied in that moment. And because I swam, the next time I had to jump in the pool, I was able to do a lot more laps.
Beautiful. And how long were you there at that hospice in Connecticut?
For 4 years. So
Okay.
Connecticut Hospice is a really fascinating place. It's the first in the US. It was the ground zero for the whole hospice movement, founded by the dean of the Yale Nursing School, Florence Wald. And a 54-bed facility right on the Long Island Sound. In those 4 years, I had about 2,500 patients on my roster. So you got to imagine a 22-year-old kid, a little scared of the world, a little scared of that role. It truly was a refinement by fire type of moment. And I arrived to that work, Ken, having, when I was 14 years old, let's bring it back to a question or an inquiry here. I was 14 years old visiting my grandparents up in Maine where they had retired. I grew up in Massachusetts, and it was 2 weeks before my freshman year of high school. A couple of aunts and uncles came to visit while my kid sister and I were visiting my grandfolks. And within a couple of hours of my aunts and uncles arriving, we're having lunch. My aunt drops dead at the kitchen table while we're eating. And we're in rural Maine. It takes a while for the paramedics to come. I'm watching my grandmother's. My grandfather was unraveling. My grandmother and my uncle were trying to revive her, and it didn't work. And it was my first exposure to loss and seeing adults terrified. And here's what happened right after that, Ken. Nobody knew how Joe was coping and dealing with this, which, to be clear, not well. But you know what else didn't happen? Nobody asked a question. And in not asking a question, not only did none of the adults in my life understand my own unraveling my freshman year of high school, they also didn't express that they cared, that they were worried about me. They didn't give me an affirmation that this could be okay. And so 14-year-old Joe had all that grief, all those thoughts bottled up inside, and had to go it alone because there were no questions.
Wow. So the grieving 14-year-old, and then we get to 22 and being in hospice. How did that work? Well, actually, so let me preface that, or let's ask that question. I've got a follow-up to this. Knowing yourself as you do today, the self-awareness, if you today been able to sit with that 14-year-old self and ask those questions, how do you think that would have changed you?
Oh, it would have changed everything, because after I was 22, I was 25. And from the time that I was 25 and I was 40, I was building children bereavement programs and creating those environments for those questions. And so it was the absence of questions that inspired me to create the communities where the questions and the exploration was okay, because I wasn't okay, because I didn't have that safe environment. I was growing up in the 90s in a highly stigmatized grief society, and it still is today. And I hope we'll talk about that some. But what I would have received then by folks asking me questions is an answer to my question: am I alone in this? Are my thoughts ridiculous? Am I a little crazy here? What does this mean? I saw somebody die, and I need to process this. I need to contextualize it for this present moment, but also for my life, that ultimately this event is transformational for how I see the world and who I will become, right? I didn't have the space for that.
Wow. The value of questions or the availability of questions and somebody willing to ask them and hear whatever that answer is.
That's right.
I've grown to appreciate that concept of just witnessing through conversation as folks have opened up. And in many cases, they've opened up in just amazing ways and told stories. Oftentimes, walking away, I felt that my role here really was just to be present and to listen and to be a witness. They could be able to communicate out these things.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we go from that 14-year-old self to the 22-year-old self. How did that transition work? I mean, you saw someone die when you were 14 that was so traumatic, and now at 22, so 10 years later, after doing all the growing up in college, you are now at ground zero daily for seeing people make this transition or being present. From the outside, I would say, if something traumatic happened to me at 14, that probably means that I'm not going to be engaging so deeply in this work when I get to be 22, 24. So why is it that there was a draw for you to even be working in that capacity?
Yeah. I was searching for answers and
Okay.
for meaning because I wasn't getting it from anywhere else. So even though I was serving in a hospice role, the religious tradition that I was raised on was falling out from beneath me. I no longer felt a sense of belonging in that community. I was in a developmental cycle of trying to understand myself, understand that event, and navigate why are we here? What is the meaning of all of this? Is
Mm.
that very primal question that we must address every day and through most events in our life. And I would think I was just crazy enough to go to ground zero and go to the heart of it. You mentioned the founder of Grateful Living, and I'm sure we'll talk more about
Mm.
that in our conversation. But Brother David Steindl-Rast, he is a really fascinating guy. He is Austrian, born into a multi-faith family. Dad was Catholic, mom was Jewish, drafted into the German army, fled, all of his friends murdered. Yeah, when he fled, people died to keep him alive. As an act of
Wow.
defiance against the Nazis, he and his friends were reading The Rule of Saint Benedict. And for folks who don't know that, Benedict is a monastic, I think something like maybe the 9th, 8th century, 6th century, 12th, I don't know, pick a number, a long time ago.
Yeah.
And that is the Benedictine monks, right? They're like the Catholics have different orders and groups. It's a way of living and being in religious community. He's a Benedictine, the founder, Benedict. He wrote to keep death before your eyes every day. And that inspired Brother David to get through World War II. It is what led him into getting his PhD in psychology. And then inevitably, he joined a monastery and became a Benedictine monk. And I think one of the reasons why I connected with him early on in divinity school when I first read his work is because that is what my experience felt like. I had death in front of me, and it was this incredible disruptor, right? And death is, it completely implodes our life. Grief is this thing that puts it back together, but death implodes it. And it's an invitation to reorient to your life, to be present, to be grounded. It is a metric through which you can look at every stressful situation, that you can look at uncertainty, and you can recognize that this precious moment, whether it is good, whether it is challenging, whether it is full of joy or sorrow or all of the above, it is fleeting. So tune in. And I think when I was 14, I became so attuned that it just set me on this path. And I just kept tuning in more and more deeply in the same way in which Brother David, after World War II, he also tuned in based on those words that he read.
In a couple interviews that I saw him conduct, I was dumbfounded by the aspect of, I guess the term is mystic, where he is so conversant and knows deeply of all of these different faith traditions and is able to see the connection points and know where they don't connect and to be able to appreciate both aspects of them.
Yeah.
It's just like, I guess that's where you get to. If you've been intentional, you need 98 years or you need, a century of living to be able to get to that point. Because I was just dumbstruck by that ability. And there was no arrogance about any one over the other or any being better than the other. It's just an appreciation and an acknowledgement for all of it. It's just like,
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it's remarkable. He is the pioneer of interreligious movement in the US. As much time as he spent as a Benedictine monk, he's also spent tons of time in monasteries with Zen priests, good friends with the incredible Thich Nhat Hanh, Dalai Lama,
Mm.
Hindu priests, right? And what he learned in by asking good questions is the common ground across all of these different religious movements over millennia. The thing that we all share as humans and what religion is articulating is a gratitude, a gratefulness for the gift of life. Right? That is the through line across the human experience to those who attune. It is the through line that is in every religious organization. And of course, we know that a lot of religious organizations are really messy and they have
Mm.
lost their way and they've become dogmatic rather than pastoral. And we can offer up all sorts of feedback to them on comment cards, Yelp reviews, however we want to provide them with our feedback. But at the
Indeed.
end of the day, the purpose they're trying to serve is a recognition that life is a gift and what are we to do with it. And that was the inquiry I had when I was 14, after that death. It is the inquiry I've carried with me my whole life and in every aspect of work, especially while witnessing the grief of young kids and families after a death.
Gratitude for the gift of life. I come out of a evangelical Christian tradition, and there it's a gratitude to God. That's where the gratitude is focused, if you will. When I see beauty or I acknowledge there's some reason to be grateful. When we say gratitude, what is the object in which we give gratitude? Is gratitude itself just sufficient to exist? Or does there need to be an object to whom it is the thanks is given?
Yeah.
Uh,
Oh, well, Brother David would say is it is enough to give thanks for the next breath.
mm,
And I think, uh, you're wondering about who the recipient is for our gratitude and our thanks. But I think we are the recipients of the gift, the fact of all the miracles that had to exist to get us that precious breath and all the miracles that have to happen to sustain it to this very, very moment. From how every ancestor that predated you met and the moment they decided to conceive the one who came before you and the one after that led all the way to your grandparents, to your parents, to you, right? It's just all of that magic, all of that awe, and to appreciate that, I think that is a great Thanksgiving. And if we have a foundational perspective, right, this is what it means to have an orientation to life. If we examine ourselves and we look to discover meaning in our existence, and the way we do that is that we have a baseline belief that to exist is a gift, right? This thing that is not promised to us, that we didn't have to earn it, we didn't have to deserve it, and yet we get the beauty of nature, we get the beauty of music and love and relationships and sex and good food. God, I'm really starting like an Italian right now. Those wonderful joys, we just receive them. And I got to tell you, let's bring it back to death one more time. Because of those 2,500 patients I told you about, very, very, very few of them were eager to exit stage left. It was only through pain they were like, okay, I'm good here. But even through unbelievable adversity, look at somebody like the often quoted Viktor Frankl, or through living through Holocaust, Auschwitz, and writing about meaning, in the variety of devastating ways that we suffer, we still persist to live because life is beautiful. And yet, I think a great injustice that has happened to gratitude is in its commercialization. It has the benefits of it, the benefits of lowering stress and appreciating all that is good and wonderful about life. It's spun into silver lining all of the messiness. It is turned into toxic positivity. But gratitude, gratefulness, is a celebration of life and an acknowledgement that it is a gift. And it is an acknowledgement that it is chock full of joy. It is chock full of the unimaginable. It is chock full of all of these things that are just a part of the human situation. And so often, what we do, you used a word earlier, Ken, that is just so caught up in the vernacular: trauma. I don't look at my aunt's death as traumatic. By definition, trauma is a self-perceived threat. The threat wasn't to me, it was to
Mm.
her. I've had traumatic experiences. I've had two really major ones that have required some significant therapeutic intervention, and death is not trauma. The way that death happens can lead to some trauma, but death by itself is
Okay.
a normal part of the human situation. But what we've done as a society is we have abnormalized what is normal, and we have a real propensity these days to normalize what is abnormal. And when we're able to differentiate and we're grounded in life being a gift, we're able to acknowledge that the good will pass, the challenging will pass. Every step is a part of the way forward. And attuning to this moment is where we really get to appreciate this gift. And I think it is in that appreciation that the thanks is offered up. Who receives it? Well, I think we receive it. Those around us receive it. The earth receives it, because if we are grateful, you damn well better believe we're going to be better stewards of
Mm.
this home.
Right.
We're going to be better in relationship. We're going to show up to situations that seem impossible, but we're still going to be there because we have compassion and we know that somebody else is suffering. And presence matters more than getting it right. Being there matters more than whatever discomfort it takes to get there. So it permeates every aspect of our life if we are grounded in it moment by moment, day by day.
That's helpful. What are some of the ways gratitude has been cheapened? What are ways to intentionally undo that, or to get back to the heart of it instead of the cheap knockoffs that we've been paying attention to?
I don't want to dismiss the power of just saying thanks, just the acknowledgement and the search to be grateful in a moment. That is a step in the right direction. I think how it's been cheapened is that we've come to look at it culturally as this: you must be positive, you must look for the bright side. If you're not grateful right now, there's something wrong with you. There are many things, as Brother David says, for which we cannot be grateful, but that doesn't mean we can't be grateful in every moment. We can search for what is good, what is meaningful, what is sustaining us. And it is the most simple things. It is all the things we take for granted. It's the clean water. It's the fact that you and I can plug in our laptops and have this conversation, and strangers can become friends. It's an acknowledgement that no one of us is an island, that we are interdependent, we rely on each other. And if we do not find a way to cooperate, we collapse. Like, that is the reality. I don't know about you, Ken. I'm super handy, but I'm not a great gardener. I can't grow my own food. I don't know how to build an aqueduct to water this proverbial garden. I'm going to go hungry super fast if this little web of farmers doesn't exist. Also, like, kind of asthmatic, so I don't really do well with smoke fire. So I prefer electricity over having to burn coal and wood, right? Everything we do, this is a web of relationships. And we need to, first and foremost, acknowledge that.
Do appreciate teasing that out a little bit. So my intention was for the conversation was to go linearly between grief and then do a hard shift over to gratitude.
Yeah.
But I don't think this is really how it's going to work out. I think that this is going to be a flowing conversation back and forth between both grief and gratitude. So what is misunderstood about grieving?
Yeah, it is all interconnected. And hopefully by the time our conversation concludes, listeners will start to see the through line of questions that accompany the grief experience. So I think first and foremost, in order to think about how we support, engage somebody who is grieving, we've really got to make some significant paradigm shifts around what is grief. So how we've been talking about grief has come a long way since my work began 20 years ago. And even though it's come a long way, we still have a very, very long way to go. And some of this I've already mentioned. But death and grief are normal. That doesn't diminish their intensity, the severity of it, and all of the very devastating aspects of it can. But as I said earlier, death is the thing that implodes your life, and grief is the thing that puts it together. And it puts it back together by navigating you through the discomfort, through the uncertainty. So let me break it down for you. And so it doesn't sound too much like I'm wearing rose-colored glasses here. But think about it this way. Across all of time, Ken, all of humanity, every culture, every single demographic, we all share a response to loss. That response is called grief. And what do we know about ourselves as humans? That we are designed to survive. So would this universal human experience exist within us if it did not serve our survival? And I am convinced that the answer is no. Now, to help people understand this, let's answer the question, like, what is grief? It's not an emotion. It's all of the emotions. It's sad, it's joy, it's relief, it's rage, it's anger, it's numbness, it's betrayal. It is not one, but all. It is a physical experience in which we are exhausted and we lose our appetite, or we overeat, we sleep constantly, or we have sleep deprivation, we have somatic symptoms. It is an intellectual experience. It's our brain work. Our brain tries to understand what the hell just happened. How could somebody be eating a tuna melt lunch with me one moment, and now I am watching my grandmother and my uncle try to revive that person, right? The brain is trying to form new neurological pathways to understand this event. It is a spiritual experience in which we wonder, why did this happen? Why did this happen to me? Why did this happen to the person? And of course, once again, what is the meaning of this? And the fifth aspect of it is social. People show up, people disappear. It leads to support, or it leads to isolation and loneliness. And I would really argue that that last point, out of all five of these, when illness does creep in, it is most closely tied to the social, which is to say that what is most hard about grief, when it goes awry, it is because of what we do to each other, what we don't do to each other, the questions that we don't ask, the ways in which we don't show up, when we allow our own discomfort and anxiousness to get in the way, and then we read the wrong prayer for 10 minutes. That is where so much of the ungluing occurs. And so what are we to do with this grief and all of the uncertainty that's baked into it? And it is this liminal space of something else is on the horizon. And grief, in so many ways, is that bridge from this to that, the devastating loss to whatever potential exists for your future. I would say that there, just as a word of advice to listener, that grief is a unique experience to every person. There are a lot of self-help gurus out there that make me lose my mind. They're particularly on TikTok, of course, as many opinionated things are. But there are 8 billion different paths to go about grief that accompany the 8 billion people that cohabit this planet with us. And so when folks are consuming information about grief, I always encourage people to listen to the thing that sounds most universally true, because that is the thing that likely has the wisdom baked into it. All of the little sideways paths most likely is somebody else's need or bias constructing that recommendation. Based on my experience and witnessing thousands of stories, here are what I think the 3 things that we need to do to healthily navigate our grief. The first is to acknowledge it. Just acknowledge it rather than deny it. To say that this is real, to say that this is hard, that maybe this feels absolutely impossible and is the last thing you want to be experiencing right now. And when we acknowledge it, that means we can embrace it. And I'm talking about give it a big old bear hug, right? Embrace it rather than run, rather than avoid, rather than suppress. To say, I see you. I know you are here. I know you were trying to serve me in some way. And I'm going to create the space and I'm going to take the time to explore what it is you are doing in me to help me find my way forward. And the last part is to integrate it so that you can go on living and loving. And the integration is to say that you are a person who has lost. You have experienced this grief, this loss of a loved one, relationship, perhaps a role, an identity. So often I heard folks, a mom who lost their only child, am I still a mom? Lost one of 4. Am I still a mother of 4? Right? That sense of who am I now that this precious being is gone? And I think the last thing I'll say about the integration is when we integrate this into who we are, it shifts how we perceive and respond to the world and find our way forward, right? It shifts ultimately our perspective. And I think in all of this, there are a couple of questions for ourselves that are baked into it. So where is the meaning in this moment? How will I live my life based on or despite the events that have occurred? And here's where I think the real big one is. Who do I want to become? There is an invitation that just lingers, right? You can accept it. You can run from it. Option, like the choices are yours. But it is an invitation to who do you want to be as somebody who is fully integrated, explored, sat with what has happened to you, the importance of that relationship, how it follows you. Just because that person is gone does not mean that they're, say another way, I like to refer it as absent presence. Someone is gone, they are absent, but they are still present based on what they gave you, based on what they denied you, based on how they cared for you, based on how they didn't do you right. So whatever the nature of that relationship is, we are changed by the people who accompany us in our lifetime.
Your question, who do I want to become as a result of this? That one carries a lot of weight. When things are thrust upon you, someone dies of a heart attack or the thing happens suddenly, then Okay, so now you can reel with that question later on. But if you've got a dying parent that is on the dementia train, or you can see this coming, and it's real, right? It's not, oh, I'm midlife, I'm going to die someday. Okay. But where you can see the end of the timeline is growing closer, to not rush to it, but at least spend time considering, okay, I know that this transition is coming soon, and to almost think ahead, to build a container in which you can move into, and to say, this is what I think integration may look like. Let me move towards that. And knowing that it's probably only 50% right.
10 if you're lucky. Yeah, it's what we call anticipatory grief. There's the unexpected death, where it feels like an instantaneous implosion. And then that comes with its own myriad of feelings and reactions, and go back to those 5 components. Like, how do you process that? How do you answer the question of, why did this happen? And then the example of somebody who has a long terminal illness, that's really complicated too, because the emotional and physical energy of caretaking, when it is over, can lead to relief. And that relief can then lead to guilt. And that's on the parent side. What is it like to do long-term caretaking for a spouse when a whole bunch of different emotional, physical needs can't be met, right? So much accompanies that type of loss. This is the power of question. So rather than assume that somebody dropping dead is the worst type of loss, somebody who had to be a caretaker for 5 years may be experiencing just a complete reorientation, whole rebirth. And so how can our questions help us understand what this experience is like, what this day is like, right? Because we are talking moment to moment. It's very fluid. And we know for sure, and anybody who has lost anything meaningful, significant, deep to them, knows that grief, nothing about it is linear. Just like this conversation. We're on a journey together, folks. And
Yes.
Grief is that. It is a roller coaster. It's up, down, all around. You think you've gone 5 steps ahead. And then one day you're walking down the cereal aisle at the Publix. That's a Southern grocery store for those who don't know. And you see cornflakes. And it's like, it's been 5 years, but you lose it. You have a grief burst because that's cereal just on that day with, that horrible soundtrack that they play at the grocery stores. It all ties it all together. And that it was your person's favorite cereal, or you remember a meal, and then boom, it hits you, right? That's grief. That is normal. And my goodness, what a sacred, beautiful opportunity to have those moments, to be reminded of the people we love. What a shame it would be if we could fully compartmentalize and erase their memory. Who would want that? And who would want that for ourselves? And so this is the human situation at work. Our love is accompanied by pain. It is the paradoxical nature of, this horrible thing just happened to me, and everybody around me, they are a bunch of fools saying all sorts of crazy stuff to me, and I can't stop laughing. I can't believe that person just said that thing to me, and it is hilarious. Or just like this silly, wacky stuff that happens around death, like so many stories. And to be able to have that profound pain and that joy and laughter at the same time, that's where it's at. And walking that line, I think, is where our grief can be healthiest.
I'm sure that the list is long, but top 1 or 2 things that are just not helpful for serving someone?
The list, I think, is subjective. let's go bring it back to the top of our conversation. Part of what's important to a good question is how you are arriving to that question. So if you're arriving with assumptions about what this must be like for somebody, if you're arriving to meet your own need because you're just super curious about, oh, how did that happen? Those are things that can actually spoil a moment, an opportunity to understand, to learn, to strengthen your connection with another person, to be an empathic and caring presence to them. So I'll give you two stories. Well, I want to focus with one, which is a shift that I've made in my own thinking. So I would sit with so many young families for the 15 years that I was building and leading children's bereavement centers in New Jersey at an organization called Good Grief. I spent the first part of that program design sitting down with every single family, right? I had, as my team grew, others did that too, but I was constantly interacting with families, enrolling them in the program. And then later on, as I had more leadership roles, I was still plugged in leading groups. And I would hear stories from kids about all the insensitive things that people were saying to them. And some are really egregious and terrible, like, well, you have another sibling. Aren't you over it yet? All of these horrible
Wow.
qualifiers. And those are really unhelpful things to say. And people put their foot in their mouth constantly because they don't know better, because they haven't walked this path before. They don't yet understand the depths of pain that somebody is experiencing. And I'll tell you, Ken, I had a lot of self-righteous indignation along the way. And, oh, how could people
Mm.
do that? And in 2013, when I wrote my book on children's grief, I put a lot of snarky stories in there because I was in a really snarky mood. Like, y'all have lost your minds. How are you saying this to children? Are you kidding me? But I'm in a different place now, Ken. And I mentioned all these self-help gurus on TikTok and on social media. Oh, here's not what to say. You should keep your mouth shut. You should blah, 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 blah. All these should nots. All this disempowering information in a very uncomfortable time. What does that do? That prevents people to have the courage to show up when they're needed, when they should be in the room. And so I want to understand who goes up to somebody and says he's in a better place now, because that fried me. And that was a common thing that I heard. And I was thinking about folks who say that, and people who maybe they stumble upon a reel and all of a sudden they remember the time that they said that, and they feel sort of the shame maybe a chaplain might feel after reading the wrong prayer for 10 minutes. And so let's unpack that for a sec. Let's think about that woman whose coworker died. I'm going to put this like in a Christian sort of Catholic context, because I appreciate that funeral rituals are different for everybody. But I'm going to use the ritual that I know best, which is a wake and this idea of a traditional American funeral. And so this woman decides that, oh, I want to support my coworker. I really care about her, and I am gonna have to take a PTO day because the wake's from 2 to 4, and I can't do the 7 to 9 because I got kids and I'm a single parent. But I'm gonna skip lunch. I'm gonna work extra hard. I'm gonna be there. I'm gonna drive through the traffic, as all those school buses are making it harder to get there, but I'm persevering. I'm gonna pull into that funeral home parking lot. Ew, funeral home. I'm gonna walk through that door and meet all of these strangers. Ew. What if I have to talk to them? I'm going to absorb all of these sad feelings that just seem to seep in the air. Ew. I'm going to have to, Karen from the office, she's 5 people up in this line, and here's all of her relatives. I have to shake their hand and say, what? Ew. I'm making my way up. Oh, I know Karen. I'm here because I work with Karen. Oh my God, there's a dead body over there. And here's Karen. I finally made it up to her after all of this ew. By the way, I don't think any of this is ew. I'm just trying to understand poor Karen. Like, let's paint the scene here, folks.
Yeah.
And I lean in and I give Karen a hug, and my heart breaks for her. And this has to be so hard. I can't imagine it. I've never tried imagining it, but I've heard a lot of people say this thing. And so I'm going to say it because I don't know better. And at least he's in a better place. And Karen might think multiple expletives. Right on you, Karen. I understand. Karen might be like, oh, that doesn't work for me. Maybe Karen actually believes that because the past 5 years have been a hellscape for her husband and his illness. But here's what I can tell you, Ken. This hypothetical person didn't go through all of that, show up when she didn't have to, in order to give a hug, speak those words, and say, ha ha, Karen, gotcha, made it worse. Wasn't that really unpleasant for you? Because that's what I came here to do. No. And while Karen has very much a right to reject anything that does not work for her, what she may also be rejecting is a friend who will be there for her when I assure you most of the people in that room aren't going to be there. Right? Like, there's going to be a lot of abandonment. This person may not show up and say a lot of helpful things in the future, but they may be consistent. They may carry your workload back at the office so that you can get by when you can't string together a thought. And so if we continue to lash out and write off people who ask the wrong questions and say the wrong things, we will miss whatever opportunities are in front of us to deepen a relationship with somebody else. But if we pause and we say, hey, this person went through all of that, and the words may not have been right. Oh, but her presence really mattered to me. I think we got to think about it differently, because we need those friends showing up for us, even if they're not landing it on the first, second, or third try.
It is a gracious way and an open-hearted way of being able to receive what the intention is. To your point in walking through that scenario, I think that's helpful.
Mm-hmm. Took me a long time to get there, because I really self-righteous indignation, for sure. Like, why would you say that? You just haven't walked that path yet to know any differently. Mercy and kindness and patience and generosity go a real long way. I think one of the things we don't do is have the courage to also say that indirectly to people who are hurting. Through gentle exploratory questions, we can help this hypothetical Karen woman who's upset by her coworker understand that her coworker was there to do good. The other story I was going to tell, it's really sad, the frequency of this that I came to see, where I'll just use one real family, 3 kids, all under the age of 15. Dad died in his early 40s, close-knit family. After Dad's death, Dad's parents, who were a really integral part of the family, stopped coming around, because being around their son's kids and wife was so painful. They couldn't cope. And this happens with some regularity. And of course, there are family tensions. Somebody didn't like the spouse, something happened 10 Christmases ago, and we still are holding grudges, and we just incapable of clearing the slate here, despite terrible events. But all sorts of reasons contribute to this. And this one of many moms that I'm thinking about was just so obsessed because she was so hurt by the fact that her in-laws couldn't be there for her. And that is where her emotional energy was going. Those were the thoughts that were consuming her, thoughts about them. And what was happening in that moment? Well, she was missing all of the strangers who were showing up for her, all of the people who were coming out of the woodworks and who were reliable and unexpected, old friends who were becoming anew. Right? And this was within a year of the loss. And she couldn't see it because she was so hurt by this other thing. And yeah, be hurt by that because it is hurtful and it is hard, but also. And so much of grief is the but also, the and, right? It's one and after another versus this or that, black or white. It is the land of so much grayness.
Wow. That's helpful. What questions do you carry with you and often revisit?
Well, my moving from grief into gratefulness, and for me, I see a real clear through line. Again, life is precious. I keep death before my eye, understanding that at any moment it could be over. And my work now is about empowering people to have a daily practice and to be grounded in an orientation of their life towards gratefulness. And so, as part of my practice of what I preach and what I try to live into, I think the questions that linger with me and that I return to intentionally are very much ones that ground me in the present moment. Because I'm a kind of anxious person. I can get caught up in the future, and I have a bit of a cause and effect strategic sort of mind that comes out of some past traumatic events where it's like, okay, if this one thing happens, then this, then that, then that. So I do a lot of scenario planning. And so I got to go, hold on, Joe, you were way ahead of yourself. There's not a chicken or an egg. You got a barbecue on the table. You killed the thing already. So I always come back to, what does this moment have to offer me right now? Not in 20 minutes, but right now. Even something as simple as, what surprising thing might come out of my mouth to you, Ken, in this conversation I didn't anticipate? And I go back, I hear it and go, oh, that was an insight that I didn't even know I was having for myself. It's a very present moment thing. I really focus on, what can I celebrate today by seeing it anew rather than something that is mundane. Right? We get caught up in our habits in a way in which stuff that is so invigorating could feel really steel. Just this morning, took the dog for a walk in the woods, and it's rutting season, and there were 4 does and one hell of a buck. And listen, I'm going to annoy a bunch of environmentalists out there. I live in the woods. These deer are like rodents. I can't grow a thing here. There are just so many of them. And so generally my feeling towards deer are, it leans towards animosity. And I know this about myself. I get feedback on it regularly. But in that moment this morning, that buck had a gray shimmer to him that was really different than the doe. His nozzle, his snout had more of a square rather than cylindrical look to it. His antlers were huge. Like, this was not a baby buck. This guy came to most of these deer running around are probably his. Like, he's been on a journey making deer babies for a while, and he was exquisite. If he was a human, he'd be like this beefcake who went to the gym every single day. And the doe, and maybe even me, we were all like, wow, that's something. And, that's moving away from the mundane. And then I think, so it's the celebrating of the ordinary, because it is extraordinary. And lastly, I try at least once a day to savor something that could be my last time encountering it, because that's the reality. Tomorrow's not guaranteed. Neither is 3 hours from now. I've heard those stories. I've seen those stories. It ends just like that. And so being grounded in this newness and this appreciation changes my perspective, especially on the tough days. It's a reminder. It's a callback. It's an invitation. to myself, to the moment.
And that idea of this might be the last time, probably having those on a pretty regular basis. Like the last time I was in that store was 10 years ago. I mean, just even those kinds of things, not just the last time that I saw my child or something like that, but to your point, probably happening pretty regularly.
Yeah. How do you think that's changing your relationship or response to those observations or moments?
When I notice them, it does foster an appreciation
Mhm.
to go, huh, where I work at, we've got a lot of buildings that have a lot of history with them.
Mm.
And there's some changes that are coming to the area. There may be some last times
Mm.
walking past a building that's has a very, very rich history and thinking about those folks that had worked in it over all these years. There's a tinge of sadness for change that's around the corner, but also the gratitude for the days that I've walked into the office and the sunlight has hit the bricks in a particular way.
Mm.
I like that concept of thinking about this might be the last time and being aware of that. I know Ryan Holiday talks a lot about memento mori
Yeah.
and thinking about death and letting that be in front of us.
Yeah, and I think for anybody listening who's feeling a little anxious right now about this conversation, that's normal. That's okay. I affirm
Mm.
you. I see you. Uh, but I also invite you to have a bit of an open heart to it and imagine, because as you're talking, Ken, I can hear, or I can suspect that perhaps with those observations, you're having a slightly different day. I don't want to say a better day, but you're having a different
Mm.
day as a result of making those observations and savoring. And so, yeah, I'd invite your listeners to imagine how might your day, how might the next tough choice that is ahead of you go a little differently if you see your life as a gift and are reminded that soon it will be over.
You mentioned when you were in Connecticut that there were very few people that got to the end and were looking forward to the transition apart from just the removal of pain.
Hmm.
What was common about them, or what were some of the characteristics by which they were there and willing to embrace the moment that they were in?
The question, Ken, is about those who were ready to die.
You had mentioned that out of the thousands of folks, there were very few that got to the end and were like, okay, or they weren't frozen up, locked up with fear, anxiety. I'm assuming some folks were like, I'm just ready. I'm done with this pain. I've had it for however long. I'm just ready for this experience to be done with. So setting those folks aside and setting aside the massive number of folks who had the anxiety and struggling with, I don't want to let this life go. You had this small, I'm assuming a small number that were like, okay, I've lived life, or I turn that over to you to be able to describe maybe what some of that perspective was for those folks.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked the question because I think it gives me a chance to clarify a little. And as you're
Okay.
repeating my words back to me, I can hear what I conveyed. I think so. There were patients who, because of pain and maybe everybody in their life was gone. They were in their 90s and they've outlived their most precious people. And they're like, okay, let's do this. There was that type of group.
Mm.
I would say that the vast majority, those who were cared for by a support system, family, friends, and even something more extended like a hospice team, the vast majority were arriving at a sense of readiness and acceptance. So, what I don't want to convey is a denial and strong resistance. That resistance
Mm.
absolutely existed. And that resistance came out in a bunch of different ways. Thinking of a patient, Lenore, who had a brain tumor and she was diagnosed with it 2 months before she was my patient. And would die within a month's time from that. And she had two young boys. They're probably 8 and 12, if memory is right, where she had this sense of readiness, but also like, my God, I can't believe I have to leave my babies. I think the anxiety is with us, but the point I want to convey is, even while we may arrive at a readiness because we're just really clear about what's happening to us, and we recognize that our moments are dwindling very, very quickly, nonetheless, it's what I heard time and time again: life, the relationships, the things that people loved. It's very, very hard to let go of it, to say goodbye, to recognize that it is over. And I think the sentiment that is so often conveyed is a one of hopefulness, that what has been left behind, what has been given, was good, that they properly cared for the people that mattered to them. And if they came up short, that they acknowledged it and perhaps did a little bit better. But there is also this reality where the Tuesdays with Maury, all of the Hollywood scenes of deathbed conversions where the jerk all of a sudden, like, oh my God, I missed that. He actually kind of a good guy, totally figured it out on the 11th hour. And yeah, thanks, Dad, for being a expletive. And now, God, I didn't know you had it in you to do me right. No, really, it happens. It does happen. Those are few and far between. We tend to die the way we lived. And that is why it is important that we live really well, because you're not going to get to that deathbed and say, oh, now's my chance to clean up my mess. No, because A, drugs, they're great, but good luck speaking through those. B, you're probably in pain. C, like, it comes on really, really quickly. And D, you've done the damage. You're lucky if people still come and even want to say goodbye or would even be receptive of how you treated them. This is the reality of all of our messy, complicated, unfolding lives. But what comes with that is this perpetual invitation, day after day, that the beginning is always anew, and we really can start over if we were willing to do that work. And I do want to encourage that when thinking in this way, it's not about always growing and growing and growing, and you got to be better and you're not good enough. That's not right. Those are not the messages that we should be receiving. What we should be receiving is the invitation to show up every day, greet it with what it has to offer, tune into it, learn from it, swim through it by doing, and with intention to do our best to carry what is good in that moment into the next. We're just not going to get it right every time. And we desperately need more self-compassion on top of all of the compassion we need to be sharing out with everyone. And I mean literally everyone around us. I think that's part of the beauty of the grateful life and practicing gratefulness. It is ultimately an empowerment. When you see your life as a gift, the invitation to show up to it every day as such, it empowers you to say yes to joy without putting conditions on it. Even if you're still grieving right now or you're going through something really hard, it empowers you to have a passion for all that is possible. Possibility is about achievability. There is something in every moment that is possible. To be dumbstruck by the beauty that permeates life, relationships. Another word for that is awe. To Oh my goodness, if only we all would embrace the imperfect life. Because let's be really clear about what perfection is. Perfection is defined as completion. And do you really want to live a complete life right now? What is
Mm.
news, right? Imperfection, the messiness and the mud. What the Buddhist teacher that I mentioned earlier, Thich Nhat Hanh, would say, no mud, no lotus. It's got to get that flower blooms in the gunk, right? And then lastly, I think where the empowerment of the grateful life gets real is belonging, that embrace that we are interdependent, right? I was talking about it earlier. No one of us can do this alone. We're social creatures. We depend on each other. And to understand gratefulness in this way is really important because it challenges us to care for each other and to understand each other, especially at a time when those two things are lacking. And so when we think in this way, when we think about life as a gift, when we think about our mortality and acknowledge it, it asks us who belongs, who is worthy of love and dignity and nourishment, who deserves mercy and understanding, who is
Mm.
my sibling on this fickle earth. And, this is a podcast about questions, but I'm going to ask the question and I'm going to answer it for you,
Mm.
Ken. And I'm going to
Excellent.
cheat and tell you that
Excellent.
the answer is everyone. And if everyone is not your answer, you have some deep work to do. So I'm just going to go on and go get right with yourself, because if your answer to those questions aren't everyone, you got something in you that you got to address. And that is our shared path forward, all of us doing our work so that our answer to those questions is everyone.
Beautiful. So I want to ask the question, which I think your answer may be replay what we just said.
Is that an
But
option?
this is going to be coming out right after the election in America. And there's been lots of angst. So, what are your thoughts from all that you know about grieving, all that you know about gratitude? What can people, and we don't know the results of the election other than a bunch of folks are going to be happy or relieved and a bunch of folks are going to be upset.
Yeah.
What is your heart? What is your thoughts for those folks that are plugging in the earbuds and trying to muddle their way through whatever the results are?
Well, I share in the great anxiousness of the moment, and the election results matter greatly. Of course they do. But we also have to remember that we have been getting it real wrong for quite some time. I think about the first time voters right now, right? Go back 9 years, so much of what is abnormal has been normalized, and they're heading to the voting booth. I think, Ken, this is the power of questions, and we are not asking the right questions at this time. It is not about yes, it is about some particular candidates. Of course, that puts us on a path to a particular direction. But at the end of the day, we are already on a major interstate that requires deep reconciliation, deep work, deep understanding. And I wrestle immensely with what are the questions we have to be asking ourselves that go far beyond an election. There's an amazing peace activist. He's been on every single continent, done unbelievable work. I adore him. He is a prophet. His name is John Paul Lederach. And in John Paul's work with gangs and tribes and mass genocide and looking for peace, there is only one common denominator between those who arrive at peace and those who don't. It is when two people with different perspectives decide now is the time to make an improbable friend. I will sit down and I will work to understand you who I do not understand. That is courage. All of the other shenanigan rhetoric about a myriad of different things, all right? All these problem sets and this action and that action, the action that needs to happen is we need to find courageous people who are willing to make improbable friends. This is a question of how did we go from setting banquet tables where everybody has a seat to we're now all trying to cram into a bistro table. It doesn't work. And we are going to keep breaking and not living up to not only our collective potential, but our individual potential because we are caught in this rhythm. I'll tell you the thing that really broke me, Ken, and why I don't have an answer to what this question is. In 2013, I was asked to go to Sandy Hook and to meet with the siblings of the kids who were murdered. Somebody walked into a school and murdered all those babies. I know the funeral directors who cared for those bodies, and they were obliterated. And those families have gone through hell. And our country has normalized pervasive gun violence. We have normalized the murder of babies. We are okay with that. So the questions we need to be asking today way predate this election. These are questions that go to our core, to our values, who we are and who we want to become. Right? These are maladies of the soul. And if we aren't willing to ask the tough questions and to learn and understand from the challenging responses so that collectively we understand our shared belonging, then we're going to go at this for a long, long time. There aren't winners and losers. It is all of us finding our way forward. And I believe it's about that improbable friend, the courage to ask questions that lead to deeper understanding. And so that is a very huge challenge for each of us. But I really believe it's the way.
Courage and improbable friends. We're getting closer to wrapping up, but I did have a question here for you. What aspect of Brother David's work has inspired you recently?
Brother David is somebody that everybody should get to know. He's the sort of guy who says that a mystic is not a special kind of person. Every person is a special kind of mystic. He lives in the space of awe and inclusivity and wonder and surprise. And how do we actually do the hard work of everything that has come about in today's conversation? He's 98 years old. He wrote a book at 97, I think one of his best, called You Are Here. That came out a year ago. Right now, he's publishing a book on Rilke, one of his favorite poets. In German earlier this year, he had a whole reflective piece on the Tao Te Ching. He inspires me with his gentleness, his inquisitive spirit, and just this ongoing invitation to ask questions of life, and not to settle with any one answer and assume that it is the answer, but to keep asking and asking and asking, and to know that through that process, we receive more, we learn more. And I wouldn't say we become our better selves, we become our full selves, that we become more alive, right? I think, Ken, I love that. And this is one of his gifts. Our conversation has been 100% about spirituality, but we haven't called it out. Gratefulness is a spiritual practice. Keeping death before your eye is very much a spiritual practice. Spirituality, the Latin spiritu is breath. It means aliveness. So the invitation for us, how do we become more alive? What makes us more alive? And I believe that is our singular task: aliveness. Become more and more alive. And that is a seed that he has planted in me that I will be forever grateful for.
That's going to be a beautiful spot to leave folks with, is contending with that seed and caring for that seed and allowing that to grow. Yep. Do you have any last thoughts or encouragements about questions that you came in to the conversation with that we haven't explored yet?
I don't think so.
It means that it's been a good conversation.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Where's the best spot for folks to catch up with you, follow what you're excited about, and learn more about the work that you're doing?
Yeah. If anything that I've said, and I hope something resonates, and if you're curious about developing a practice that's grounded in gratefulness and orienting to your life in that way, visit us, grateful.org. We've got daily resources, practices, tips, great resources, tons of fabulous programming. And I want to plug a couple of programs here that could be really relevant to curious minds such as yours. So on the grief front, we have an on-demand grief course called Grateful Grief. I interviewed some really fabulous people. So if you're looking to frame grief a little more, I'd encourage you to check that out on the website. Also, we intentionally for this year designed a course on hope. And I interviewed John Paul Lederach, other great minds like Rabbi Sharon Brous, who encourages us to go about the world and ask people, hey, tell me about yourself. What happened to you? But a real program that I think your audience would really resonate with is one called Grateful Gatherings, where we empower anybody. And we've got gatherings in 29 countries across the globe where, come along, my colleague and I will give you a brief training on how to be a more effective facilitator. And then you can convene in person or online these gatherings of 3, 10, 15 people to engage rich and meaningful conversations about life. From what do you do with this imperfection I mentioned, to joy, to grief, just all of the aspects, and to do that in community. So at Grateful Living, we're really living into our mission and what we're trying to empower people to embody programmatically. And that Grateful Gathering, it's free. There may be one in your community, so you can also check out our directory online. But boy, oh boy, curious minds make great hosts. And so I would love for some of this fabulous audience to join us in that way.
Be remarkable. Thank you for filling in the details. And yeah, I first stumbled across the Instagram account for your organization, and it was based on the questions that were being posted. And they're like, these are great questions. So clearly there's an ecosystem of people that are building these and have this mindset.
Yes, sir.
So yes, grateful for the work that you're doing. So Joe, thank you for sharing your heart and experience and these things that can light the path for others to thrive. So thank you for that.
A joy, truly. Thank you, Ken.
You're welcome. This has been lovely. And to those on the other side of the speakers, thank you for being here. Joe delivered helpful insights into grief and gratitude, two elements of the human experience that we have all encountered, but are often misunderstood. So reflect back to what Joe said that resonated and put that into action for all that you have learned. Be a light to yourself and to those around you. Gratitude shout out to Beauty Pill for the show's music and producer Ben Ford for the technical help. This episode was recorded on Piscataway land. Please engage with this episode in some manner. Download, follow, save, like, share, or comment about something that resonated. This action ensures we are engaging the questioning community. Until next time, keep questioning.